The carriage wheels screamed against the frozen road, and Nora Whitfield gripped the seat as the entire vehicle tilted hard to one side. Outside, her stepmother's voice cracked like a whip. "Faster! We cannot be late for this." Nora said nothing. She never did. Silence had kept her safe for 18 years in a house that never once felt like home. Across from her, Camille and Iris adjusted their gloves and powdered their cheeks, glancing at their own reflections in the small carriage mirror, as if the world outside did not exist. Nora looked down at her plain gray dress, the only one she owned that did not have a tear stitched shut at the hem, and wondered why she had even bothered coming. The invitation had arrived a week earlier, sealed with the crest of the Duke of Bramwell. Every noble family within 100 miles had received one. The Duke, a man named Gideon Ashcombe, had lost his father the previous winter, and now, at 29, carried the full weight of a dukedom, with no wife beside him to share it. The king himself had suggested it was time, and so, the invitation demanded that every eligible daughter of noble blood attend a single evening at Bramwell Hall, where the Duke would choose one woman to begin a formal courtship. Nora had not wanted to go. She had begged to stay behind, offering to watch the house, to mind the accounts, to do anything that kept her out of a ballroom full of women who would spend the night reminding her, without ever saying a word, that she did not belong among them. Her stepmother, Delphine, had only laughed. "You will go," Delphine had said, "because if you do not, people will ask why, and we cannot have people asking questions about this family." So Nora went, not to be chosen, not even to be noticed. She went because refusing was a battle she could never win in that house. The carriage came to a stop at the base of a hill, where hundreds of torches lit a stone path leading up to Bramwell Hall. The building itself looked less like a home, and more like a mountain, carved by careful hands, its towers disappearing into the black sky, its windows glowing gold. Nora stepped down last, as always, and followed her stepsisters up the long path, while Delphine hissed instructions at their backs. "Smile, stand straight, and Nora, stay near the back where you belong." Nora obeyed without protest. She always did. Inside, the ballroom was already filled with more beauty and wealth than Nora had ever seen gathered in one place. Silk gowns in every shade imaginable moved like ocean waves beneath crystal chandeliers. Laughter rippled through clusters of noble women, each one watching the others, as much as they watched the grand staircase where the Duke was expected to appear. Nora found a spot near a marble column, half hidden by a large arrangement of white flowers, and there she stayed, watching the room the way she always watched rooms. From the edges, never the center. When the Duke finally appeared at the top of the staircase, the entire hall fell into a hush so complete that Nora could hear her own heartbeat. Gideon Ashcombe was not what she expected. She had imagined an older man, weathered by politics and grief, but the man descending the stairs was younger than the rumors suggested, tall, with dark hair swept back, and eyes that scanned the crowd with an unreadable calm. He did not smile the practiced smile of a man enjoying attention. He looked, if anything, like a man enduring an obligation. He greeted the room with brief, polite words, thanking them for their presence, and then the real purpose of the evening began. One by one, noble families were announced, their daughters brought forward to greet the Duke individually, a formality, before the real selection would occur later in the evening through private conversation. Nora watched Camille flutter forward when the Whitfield name was called, her laughter bright and rehearsed, followed closely by Iris, who curtsied so low it seemed designed purely to draw the eye. Nora, standing at the very end of the family line, curtsied quickly, and stepped back before the Duke's gaze could even properly land on her. But it did. For the briefest moment, as she straightened from her curtsy, she felt his eyes on her, not with the fleeting, obligatory glance he had given the others, but with something that lingered a second too long. Nora assumed she had imagined it. Men like the Duke did not look twice at women like her. The evening rolled forward, in the way such evenings always did. Music, dancing, whispered gossip behind fans. Nora found a quiet bench near the garden doors, and stayed there, watching candle flames flicker, rather than watching the crowd. She had grown skilled at making herself invisible, and invisibility, tonight, felt like a mercy. It was near midnight when the steward's voice rang out over the orchestra, calling the room to silence. The Duke had made his decision. A single name would be chosen to move forward into a formal courtship trial, a tradition dating back generations in noble houses like Bramwell. meant to allow both parties to determine compatibility before any marriage vows were considered. The ballroom held its breath. "Miss Nora Whitfield," the steward announced. For a moment, Nora thought she had misheard. The name hung in the air, foreign and impossible, and she turned instinctively to see if perhaps another Whitfield stood somewhere behind her. But there was no one. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward the marble column where she stood, and the silence broke into a wave of murmurs so loud, it felt like the walls themselves were whispering. "There must be a mistake," Camille said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "He means me. Surely he means me." Delphine's face had gone the color of ash. Iris's mouth hung open, frozen mid-breath. Nora stood rooted to the spot, certain that any moment someone would step forward and correct the terrible error, that the steward would clear his throat and announce the name he truly meant to call. But no correction came. Gideon Ashcombe stood at the top of the staircase, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been all evening, and he said nothing to contradict the name that had been spoken. He simply watched her, waiting, as if the entire ballroom's confusion meant nothing to him at all. A young woman near Nora, someone she barely knew, leaned close and whispered, "Go on, he is waiting for you." Nora's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as she stepped forward, weaving through a crowd that parted for her, with a mixture of astonishment and thinly veiled scorn. She could hear the whispers trailing behind her like smoke. "That cannot be right. Surely it is a clerical error. Poor girl. She does not even know how to walk properly in that dress." Nora ignored every word, though each one landed somewhere deep inside her, a place long practiced at absorbing insults without flinching. She reached the base of the staircase and looked up at the Duke, who descended the final steps until he stood directly before her. Up close, he was even taller than she had guessed, and there was a tiredness behind his eyes that no title or fortune could hide. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "Thank you for coming forward." "Your Grace," Nora managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe there has been some confusion. Perhaps the name intended was—" "There is no confusion," he said simply, cutting her off. Not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. The name was correct. Behind her, she could feel Delphine's fury radiating like heat from an open flame, could hear Camille's sharp intake of breath, could sense the entire ballroom recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening. Nora did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the Duke, searching his face for some explanation, some hint of the mistake she was certain must exist, but found none. "You will begin your courtship trial at Bramwell Hall in 3 days' time," he said. "A carriage will be sent for you." And with that, he turned and addressed the rest of the room, thanking them again for their attendance, dismissing the topic entirely, as though he had not just upended every expectation in the hall. Nora stood alone at the base of the staircase, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on her, and for the first time in her life, she did not know how to make herself small enough to disappear. The carriage ride home was silent, in a different way than the ride there had been. Delphine's fury had curdled into something colder, something far more dangerous than shouting. She stared out the window the entire way, her jaw tight, while Camille and Iris exchanged glances that promised trouble Nora had not yet begun to imagine. It was only when they reached the house, when Nora had climbed the narrow stairs to her small room at the back of the estate, that the full weight of the evening finally settled over her. She sat on the edge of her thin mattress, staring at her own hands in the candlelight, and allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding since the moment her name left the steward's lips. Why her? She was not beautiful in the way her stepsisters were beautiful. She had no fortune to offer, no family alliance worth pursuing, no charm carefully practiced over years of social training. She was, by every measure the world had taught her to believe, the last woman anyone would choose. And yet the most powerful man in the region had looked at a ballroom full of eligible women and chosen her. It made no sense. Unless, she thought, staring at the flickering candle flame, it was exactly the mistake everyone believed it to be, and in 3 days' time, when she arrived at Bramwell Hall, someone would realize the error and send her quietly home before the humiliation could grow any larger. She told herself this over and over, trying to make peace with a possibility that felt safer than hope. Because hope, Nora had learned long ago in that house, was a dangerous thing to carry. It was easier to expect nothing. It hurt less that way. But sleep did not come easily that night. Long after the candle had burned to nothing, Nora lay awake in the darkness, replaying the moment the Duke had looked at her. Not glanced, not merely noticed, but looked. The way one looks at something they recognize, something they have been searching for without quite knowing it. She could not explain the feeling that memory left behind, a small, stubborn warmth in her chest that refused to be reasoned away, no matter how firmly she tried. 3 days, she reminded herself. In 3 days, everything would either make sense, or it would end. Either way, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Nora Whitfield fell asleep, wondering what tomorrow might bring, instead of dreading it. She woke before dawn, the way she always did, expected to begin the day's chores long before her stepsisters stirred. But this morning, Delphine was already awake, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and an expression Nora recognized from years of experience, the calm before a storm. "You will not embarrass this family," Delphine said without preamble. "Whatever mistake has occurred, you will correct it the moment you arrive at that manor. You will tell the Duke's steward that his master meant to call another name. And if the Duke himself insists there was no mistake?" Nora asked quietly, immediately regretting the words the moment they left her mouth. Delphine's eyes narrowed. "Then you will remember exactly what you are, and exactly what you are not. You are not a duchess, Nora. You never will be. Do not let a night's confusion convince you otherwise." The words should have hurt more than they did. Instead, Nora simply nodded, gathered the morning's kindling, and went about her chores as though the conversation had never happened. She had built an entire life around absorbing such words without letting them show on her face, and this morning was no different, even if something small and unfamiliar had begun stirring beneath the surface of her carefully practiced composure. Camille cornered her later that day, in the narrow hallway outside the linen closet, her voice sweet in the way that always preceded cruelty. "You must be so nervous," Camille said, twirling a lock of hair around her finger. "Imagine standing among real ladies, trying to remember which fork to use, which words are proper. It would be such a shame if you embarrassed yourself in front of the whole household." "I imagine I will manage," Nora said simply, stepping past her. "Manage," Camille repeated, laughing softly. "Yes, that has always been your specialty, hasn't it? Managing. Surviving. Never truly living. It must be exhausting, always being the one nobody wants." Nora did not answer. She had learned long ago that answering only fed the fire, and so she continued down the hallway, letting the words fall behind her like leaves in autumn wind, present but not permanent. That evening, alone in her room, Nora opened the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the one item of furniture that had belonged to her mother before she passed. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a single faded ribbon, blue once, now closer to gray with age. It was the only physical memory Nora had left of a woman she barely remembered, a woman who had, by all accounts, been kind in a house that had long since forgotten how to be. She held the ribbon between her fingers and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a version of the next 3 days where the mistake was not corrected, where she was allowed to remain at Bramwell Hall long enough to understand why the Duke had chosen her name from among so many others. She did not know if such a version of events was even possible, but for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to wonder. 3 days, she reminded herself again, folding the ribbon back into its cloth. 3 days, and then she would know. The carriage arrived precisely on time, its dark wood polished to a shine that reflected the pale morning light. Delphine watched from the front steps with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, while Camille and Iris stood behind her, whispering to one another with poorly concealed resentment. Nora climbed into the carriage alone, carrying nothing but a small bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, and the folded ribbon tucked carefully into an inner pocket. As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Nora watched the house grow smaller through the small window, and felt, for the first time in her life, something that might have been the beginning of freedom. The road to Bramwell Hall wound through hills and forests untouched by the busy noise of the city, and Nora spent the journey with her forehead pressed lightly against the cool glass, watching the landscape shift from familiar to foreign. She did not know what awaited her at the end of that road. She did not know if the Duke's steward would meet her at the gates with an apology and a carriage ride straight back home, or if she would be permitted to step through the doors of Bramwell Hall, as something other than an error waiting to be corrected. But somewhere between the fear and the uncertainty, a small, unfamiliar feeling had begun to take root inside her chest, one she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. Curiosity. And beneath the curiosity, quieter still, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The carriage crested the final hill, and Bramwell Hall rose into view ahead of her, its towers catching the morning sun, its gates standing open, as though already expecting her arrival. Nora took a slow breath, straightened her spine, and prepared to step into a life no one, least of all herself, had ever imagined she deserved. The carriage rolled to a stop in the wide stone courtyard, and before Nora could even gather her thoughts, the door swung open from the outside. A tall woman in a dark green dress stood waiting, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression polite but distant. "Miss Whitfield," the woman said, "I am Mrs. Aldridge, housekeeper of Bramwell Hall. His Grace asked that I see you settled properly." Nora stepped down from the carriage, her legs stiff from the long ride, and looked up at the manor, towering above her. Up close, it was even larger than it had appeared from a distance, its stone walls climbing several stories high, its windows catching the light like watchful eyes. She had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, to be met with confusion or apology, some indication that the invitation had indeed been an error. Instead, Mrs. Aldridge simply gestured toward the entrance, waiting for Nora to follow. Inside, the manor was quieter than Nora expected, though no less grand. Long hallways stretched in every direction, lined with paintings of ancestors long past, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. Mrs. Aldridge led her up a wide staircase and down a corridor to a modest but comfortable room, far smaller than the guest chambers Nora imagined the other candidates might occupy, but clean and warm, with a window overlooking a quiet garden below. "You will find 4 other young women already in residence," Mrs. Aldridge explained, setting Nora's small bag on the bed. "The trial period lasts 1 month. During this time, His Grace will observe each candidate through daily interactions, shared meals, and various activities, meant to reveal character rather than mere charm. At the end of the month, he will choose." "And if he changes his mind before then?" Nora asked quietly. "About my invitation, I mean." Mrs. Aldridge paused, studying her for a long moment. "His Grace does not make decisions carelessly, Miss Whitfield. Whatever assumptions you carry about your place here, I would advise setting them aside. You were called forward for a reason, whether or not that reason is yet clear to you." The words offered little comfort, but they were more than Nora had expected, and she found herself repeating them silently long after Mrs. Aldridge had left the room. She unpacked her small bag, hung her 2 dresses in the modest wardrobe, and sat by the window, watching the garden below, where she could see a small figure moving slowly among the hedges. A boy, she realized, no older than 8 or 9, walking alone, with his hands clasped behind his back, in a manner far too formal for a child. She did not know yet who he was. She did not know that the quiet, lonely boy in the garden would become one of the first true connections she formed within those manor walls, nor that the path ahead of her held far more challenges and far more truth than she could possibly imagine on her first afternoon at Bramwell Hall. For now, she simply watched him walk, feeling the strange, fragile beginning of something she did not yet have words for, and wondered, quietly, what the coming month would reveal, about the manor, about the Duke, and about herself. The boy's name, Nora learned the following morning, was Peter, and he was not the Duke's son but his young cousin, orphaned 2 winters past and taken into Bramwell Hall out of duty rather than affection, or so the kitchen staff whispered when they thought no one else was listening. He kept to himself, ate his meals in silence, and spoke only when spoken to, a habit Nora recognized immediately because it had once been her own. She met him properly on her second day, in the same garden she had watched from her window. He was crouched beside a stone fountain, watching a family of ducks paddle in slow circles, and he startled when her shadow fell across the water. "I did not mean to frighten you," Nora said gently, keeping her distance. Peter studied her, with the wary caution of a child, who had learned that adults were rarely worth trusting. "You are one of the ladies," he said finally, "the ones trying to marry my cousin." "I suppose I am," Nora admitted, though the word marry still felt foreign attached to her own name. "The others do not come out here," Peter said. "They say the garden is boring." I think it is the nicest part of the whole manor, Nora replied, and meant it. There was something honest about a garden, something that asked nothing of her, the way the glittering halls and watchful portraits inside seemed to. Peter considered this for a long moment, then shifted slightly to make room beside him at the fountain's edge. A small gesture that felt, somehow, enormous. Nora sat, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to watch the ducks glide across the water. It became a quiet routine over the following days. While the other 4 candidates spent their mornings primping and their afternoons competing for proximity to the Duke, Nora found herself drawn again and again to the garden, to the boy who asked for nothing and expected nothing, and in that simplicity she found something she had not felt in years: ease. The other candidates noticed, of course. Beatrice Kingsley, the eldest daughter of a wealthy merchant family, cornered Nora on the 3rd afternoon in the corridor outside the dining hall. "You do understand why you are here, don't you?" Beatrice asked, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "A formality. Every trial requires an unusual choice, someone to make the rest of us look more appealing by comparison. It happened last year, with the Earl of Denholm's selection as well. Surely you don't imagine you were chosen for any real reason." Nora kept her expression steady, though the words landed exactly where they were meant to. "Perhaps you're right," she said simply, and continued walking, refusing to give Beatrice the reaction she was clearly hoping for. Inside, though, doubt crept back in, persistent as ever. It would have been easy to believe Beatrice, easier still to retreat fully into the quiet corners of the manor, and wait out the month without ever truly participating, protecting herself from a disappointment that felt, at times, inevitable. But something about the garden, about Peter's quiet trust, about the strange warmth she still remembered from the Duke's gaze across the ballroom, kept her from retreating entirely. She saw Gideon only rarely during those first days, always from a distance, always surrounded by duties that pulled him in directions Nora could not follow. He appeared distracted during the shared evening meals, responding to the other candidates' careful conversation with polite but brief replies, his attention seeming to drift toward matters far heavier than courtship. It was on the 5th evening that Nora first witnessed the weight he carried up close. She had gone to the library after the evening meal, seeking a quiet corner to read while the other candidates gathered in the music room to compete for the Duke's attention through song and performance. She had not expected to find him there, standing before the tall shelves with a letter clutched in one hand, his shoulders drawn tight with a tension she had not seen in him before. "Your Grace," she said softly, preparing to withdraw. "Stay," he said, without turning. "Please." Nora hesitated, then stepped further into the room, unsure what else to do. Gideon folded the letter and set it on a nearby table, running a hand through his dark hair before finally turning to face her. "Forgive me," he said. "It has been a difficult week. Matters of the estate rarely announce themselves conveniently." "I did not mean to intrude," Nora said. "You are not intruding." He studied her for a long moment, the same lingering look she remembered from the ballroom, though softer now, less guarded. "You are the only one who has not asked me for anything since arriving here." Nora did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and to her surprise, Gideon seemed to appreciate the silence rather than expect more from it. "I hear you have been spending time with Peter," he said eventually. "He is a good boy," Nora said. "Lonely, I think, but good." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, a flicker of something Nora could not quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. "He lost his parents 2 winters ago," he said. "I have tried to give him a home here, but a manor full of duties and obligations is not the same as a family. I am not certain I know how to give him what he needs." "I do not think anyone knows exactly how to do that," Nora said gently. "I think you simply keep trying, and eventually it becomes enough." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened further, the careful distance he kept from the world easing just slightly in her presence. "You speak as though you understand loneliness rather well, Miss Whitfield." "I have had practice," Nora admitted, before she could stop herself. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the quiet between them comfortable rather than awkward, and Nora found herself studying the tired lines around his eyes, wondering what burdens a young duke carried that made him seem, in unguarded moments like this one, far older than his years. "The others will wonder where you have gone," Gideon said eventually, though he made no move to send her away. "Let them wonder," Nora said, surprising herself with the small flash of boldness. A faint smile crossed Gideon's face, the first genuine one Nora had seen since arriving at Bramwell Hall, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I suppose I will let them," he said. They spoke for a while longer, of small things. The Manor's extensive library, a book of old maps Gideon had loved as a boy, the strange comfort of gardens over ballrooms, until the hour grew late and Nora reluctantly excused herself, aware that lingering too long might invite exactly the kind of attention from the other candidates that she preferred to avoid. As she climbed the stairs back to her room, she found herself replaying the conversation, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. There had been no grand declarations, no promises, nothing that resembled the sweeping romance she imagined must exist between dukes and their chosen brides. And yet something had passed between them in that quiet library, something honest and unhurried, entirely unlike anything she had expected to find within those manor walls. She did not yet understand why he had chosen her name that night in the crowded ballroom, but for the first time since arriving at Bramwell Hall, she began to wonder if perhaps understanding was not required for something to be real. The following morning brought a shift in the household's rhythm. Word had spread, as it always did in houses full of servants and idle candidates, that the Duke had spent an evening in private conversation with Miss Whitfield in the library, and by breakfast, the other 4 candidates regarded her with a new, sharper kind of attention. Beatrice said nothing directly, though her silence carried its own weight, calculating and cold. It was Camille and Iris's cousin by marriage, Odette Farrow, who spoke first, her voice light and teasing in a way that fooled no one.
"How lovely," Odette said, buttering her toast with slow precision.
"A private audience in the library. I did not realize books were part of the courtship trial." "They are not," Nora said simply. "I only happened to be there." "Of course," Odette said, exchanging a glance with Beatrice that needed no translation. Nora ate the rest of her breakfast in silence, aware of the eyes tracking her every movement, and reminded herself that whatever quiet understanding had passed between herself and Gideon the previous evening belonged to her alone, untouched by the whispers and calculations swirling around the breakfast table. She had spent a lifetime being underestimated and overlooked. She would not allow a week of unexpected attention to unravel the composure that had carried her through far worse. That afternoon, the household gathered for what Mrs. Aldridge described as a traditional activity of the courtship trial, a shared picnic along the riverbank at the edge of the estate, meant to allow the Duke and the candidates a more relaxed setting in which to converse. Nora arrived last, having stopped by the garden first to check on Peter, who had been unusually quiet at breakfast. She found the group already settled on blankets spread across the grass. The other 4 candidates arranged carefully around Gideon, like petals around a flower's center, each vying for position, for his attention, for the next word he might speak. Nora hesitated at the edge of the gathering, uncertain whether to insert herself into a scene that seemed to have no room left for her. It was Gideon who noticed her first, glancing up from Beatrice's animated conversation with an expression that shifted, subtly, the moment his eyes found her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and something in the way he said her name drew the attention of the entire group. "Please, join us." Nora crossed the grass and settled at the edge of the blanket, as far from the center as courtesy allowed, though she could feel Gideon's attention drifting toward her, even as Beatrice continued speaking, undeterred, about a recent trip to the capital. The afternoon passed in a strange rhythm of performance and quiet observation. The other candidates spoke of fashion, of political gossip, of accomplishments meant to impress, while Nora mostly listened, offering brief thoughts when asked directly, and otherwise content to watch the river drift past. She noticed, though, how often Gideon's gaze found her across the blanket, how his responses to the others grew shorter and more distracted the longer the afternoon wore on, until finally, as the sun began to lower toward the horizon, he rose and extended a hand toward her. "Miss Whitfield, would you walk with me? I would like to show you something along the river." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Beatrice's smile did not waver, though her eyes had turned to ice, and Odette's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Nora hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet, aware of every eye in the group tracking the movement. They walked in silence for a while, following the river's gentle curve away from the others, until the sounds of the group faded into the distance, and only birdsong and the soft rush of water remained. "You did not seem entirely comfortable back there," Gideon observed. "I have never been skilled at that kind of conversation," Nora admitted, "the kind meant to impress rather than to understand." "It is exhausting, is it not?" Gideon said, a note of genuine weariness in his voice. "I have sat through 100 conversations like that since my father passed. Everyone wanting something, performing for something, and so few simply present the way you are." "Perhaps that is only because I have nothing to perform," Nora said honestly. "I have no great fortune to offer, no impressive connections. All I have is myself, plain as that may be." Gideon stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious, in a way that made Nora's breath catch. "You misunderstand something, Miss Whitfield," he said. "Plain is the last word I would use to describe you." The words settled over her like warmth spreading through cold hands, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the quiet rush of the river beside them. Nora searched his face for some hint of performance, some practiced charm meant only to flatter, but found instead the same honest weariness she had glimpsed in the library, the same careful attention that seemed to see past the plain gray dresses and quiet manner to something else entirely. "Why did you choose my name that night?" she asked finally, the question she had carried since the ballroom finally finding its way free. "Out of everyone there, why me?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, and Nora braced herself for an answer that might dissolve the fragile warmth building between them. "That," he said eventually, "is a longer story than I am ready to tell tonight. But I promise you, Miss Whitfield, it was not a mistake. It was never a mistake." They resumed walking, the conversation shifting to lighter matters, though Nora carried his words with her long after they returned to the others, turning them over and over, aware that whatever answer he was not yet ready to give held the key to understanding everything that had happened since that strange, impossible night in the crowded ballroom. As the group finally packed up the picnic and made their way back toward the manor in the fading evening light, Nora caught Beatrice watching her with an expression that had shed all pretense of friendliness, replaced now with something colder, something calculating. Nora recognized that look. She had grown up beneath it her entire life. But for the first time, standing in the golden light of a setting sun with the Duke's unfinished words still echoing in her mind, she found she was no longer quite as frightened of it as she once might have been. Whatever storm Beatrice and the others were preparing to raise against her, Nora resolved, walking back toward the towering silhouette of Bramwell Hall, she would face it standing upright, rather than folded small, the way she always had before. Something had shifted within her over these first days at the manor, something she did not yet have full words for, but she could feel its shape beginning to form, a quiet, stubborn belief that perhaps, after a lifetime of being told she was the last choice anyone would make, she had finally found the one place, and the one person, willing to see her as something more. The days that followed the riverside walk brought a subtle but unmistakable change to life within Bramwell Hall. Gideon began seeking Nora out in small, unannounced moments, a passing word in the corridor, an invitation to join him and Peter for a quiet breakfast on the terrace, a request for her opinion on some minor matter of the estate that clearly required no opinion at all, beyond an excuse to speak with her. None of it was declared openly. None of it needed to be. The household noticed anyway, the way households always notice such things, in glances exchanged between servants, and in the tightening silence that fell whenever Nora entered a room where the other candidates had gathered. Beatrice Kingsley, for her part, had stopped pretending to be pleasant. Her comments grew sharper, more pointed, delivered always with a smile that never once reached her eyes. "It is curious," Beatrice said one afternoon, as the candidates sat together in the drawing room awaiting the day's activities, "how quickly some people forget their place when given the smallest scrap of attention. I wonder if His Grace realizes how easily some women can be mistaken for something they are not." "I have made no claims about myself, Miss Kingsley," Nora replied evenly, not looking up from the book in her lap. "I would appreciate the same courtesy in return." "Courtesy," Beatrice repeated, laughing softly, though the sound held no warmth. How amusing, coming from a girl raised on scraps and second-hand dresses. "Do you truly believe a man like the Duke of Bramwell could want someone like you for anything beyond a moment's curiosity?" The room fell silent, the other candidates watching with poorly hidden interest, waiting to see if Nora would break the way Beatrice clearly intended. But Nora had endured far worse cruelty, at the hands of her own family, for far longer than a single month, and she had long ago learned that the sharpest weapon against such attacks was simply refusing to bleed where others could watch. "Perhaps," Nora said calmly, closing her book. "He is curious about something you cannot understand, Miss Kingsley. Not everyone measures worth by fortune or fashion." She rose and left the room before Beatrice could respond, aware of the whispers trailing behind her, but no longer allowing them to slow her steps the way they once might have. Something had hardened in her since arriving at Bramwell Hall, a quiet steel she had not known she possessed, forged in the warmth of a duke's honest attention and a lonely boy's easy trust. It was Peter who found her later that evening, sitting alone on the garden bench beneath a darkening sky, and settled beside her without a word, the way he always did when something troubled him. "They are saying unkind things about you," he said eventually, his voice small. "The ladies. I heard them talking." "People often say unkind things about those they do not understand," Nora said gently. "It is easier than looking closely enough to find the truth." "Are you sad?" Peter asked, studying her face with the careful attention of a child who noticed far more than adults gave him credit for. Nora considered the question honestly before answering. "A little," she admitted, "but not as sad as I might have been once. I think I have grown stronger since coming here, Peter, perhaps because someone finally believed I was worth defending." Peter nodded solemnly, as though this made perfect sense to him, and reached over to take her hand in the simple, unguarded way children do when they trust someone completely. They sat together in comfortable silence until the stars began to appear overhead, and Nora found herself grateful, in that quiet moment, for the strange twist of fate that had brought her into this lonely boy's orbit. Word of Beatrice's cruelty reached Gideon the following morning, though not through Nora, who had said nothing of the confrontation to anyone. It was Mrs. Aldridge who mentioned it, quietly, while overseeing the morning's arrangements, unable to hide her disapproval of the way certain candidates had begun speaking about Miss Whitfield when they believed no one of consequence was listening. Gideon's expression darkened as he listened, though he said little in response beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement. That afternoon, however, Nora noticed a subtle shift in how the household staff treated her. Small courtesies extended without being asked, a warmer welcome at meals, a quiet solidarity that had not existed before. She understood, without anyone saying so directly, that Gideon had made his displeasure known, even if he had chosen not to confront the matter publicly himself, not yet. That evening, he found her in the library again, the same quiet refuge that had become, in the span of just over a week, something close to sacred ground between them. "I heard what Miss Kingsley said to you," he said without preamble, closing the door softly behind him. Nora looked up from the book she had been pretending to read, her cheeks warming slightly. "It was nothing I have not heard before, Your Grace. I did not wish to trouble you with it." "It troubles me regardless," Gideon said, crossing the room to sit in the chair opposite hers. "I will not tolerate cruelty within these walls, Miss Whitfield, whatever its source. You should not have to endure it silently." "I have spent my whole life enduring things silently," Nora said, more honestly than she intended. "It has become something of a habit." Something in Gideon's expression shifted, softened, deepened into a kind of quiet sorrow that Nora had not expected. "Perhaps it is time that habit was broken," he said. "You deserve far better than silence, Nora." It was the first time he had used her given name without title, and the sound of it in his voice sent something warm and unfamiliar rushing through her chest. She said nothing, uncertain how to respond to the weight of that single word, but she did not look away from him either, and in the quiet that followed, something unspoken passed between them, deeper than anything either had yet dared to voice aloud. "May I ask you something?" Nora said finally, gathering her courage. "That first night, in the ballroom, you said choosing me was not a mistake. You said there was a story behind it. I would like to hear it, if you are willing to share it." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the fire crackling in the hearth beside them. And Nora sensed she had touched something significant, something he had perhaps not intended to reveal so soon. "It is not a simple story," he said eventually, "and I fear that once I tell it, you may see me differently." "I would rather see you truly than continue guessing," Nora said softly. Gideon studied her for a long moment, as though weighing some final decision. And then, slowly, he began to speak of a winter 3 years past, of a young man traveling in plain clothes through a market town far from Bramwell Hall, seeking nothing more than a brief escape from the crushing weight of his father's expectations. "I was unwell that day," he said quietly. "Feverish, though I did not yet know how seriously so. I collapsed near a market stall, and no one stopped to help, not truly, except one young woman who did not know my name or my title, who simply saw a stranger in need and acted without hesitation." Nora's breath caught, some distant memory stirring at the edges of her mind, though she could not yet place it fully. "She brought me water," Gideon continued, his voice growing softer still. "She sat with me until the fever eased enough for me to stand, and she asked for nothing in return, not my name, not a reward, nothing beyond making certain I was well enough to continue on my way. I never forgot her face, though it took me a long time to learn her name." Nora's heart began to pound, the pieces of a memory she had long forgotten slowly assembling themselves into something impossible to ignore. "The market at Thornfield," she whispered. "3 winters ago, I remember a man collapsed near the baker's stall. I did not know who he was." "You knew nothing of me," Gideon said, meeting her eyes fully now, "and you helped me regardless. I searched for you afterward, Nora, though I did not know your name, only your face, and by the time I thought to return to that market properly, you had already gone. I never forgot you, not truly, and when your name appeared on the list of candidates for this trial, I recognized it as a chance I had never expected to receive again." The revelation settled over Nora like a wave breaking against still water, rippling outward through everything she had believed about the past week, about herself, about the impossible circumstances that had brought her to Bramwell Hall in the first place. It had not been chance, or error, or the whim of a distracted steward reading the wrong name. It had been memory, gratitude, and something far deeper that Gideon had carried quietly for 3 long years, waiting for an opportunity to return the kindness a stranger had once shown him, without expecting anything in return. "You remembered me," Nora said softly, still struggling to fully absorb the weight of his words. "All this time." "I could not forget you," Gideon said simply, "even when I tried." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them, and Nora felt something shift permanently within her chest, the last remnants of doubt, of disbelief, of the deeply rooted conviction that she could never truly be chosen for anything beginning, finally, to crumble away. "Why did you not simply tell me this from the start?" she asked eventually. "Because I wanted you to know me first," Gideon admitted. "Not as the stranger you helped, nor as the Duke everyone expects me to be, but as I am now. I did not want gratitude to be the foundation of whatever might grow between us. I wanted it to be built on something more honest than that." Nora considered this, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she understood completely. The past week had given her exactly that, not gratitude, not obligation, but genuine understanding, built slowly through quiet mornings and honest conversations, and the simple, steady presence of a man who saw her clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of fortune or beauty. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me." Gideon reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand gently in his, the gesture simple, but weighted with everything neither of them had yet said aloud. "Thank you," he replied, "for saving my life before you ever knew it mattered." They remained in the library long after the fire had burned low, speaking softly of the past 3 years, of the strange threads of fate that had drawn them back together despite every obstacle standing in their way, and by the time Nora finally returned to her room that night, she understood, with a clarity she had never possessed before, that whatever cruelty Beatrice or the others might still attempt, she was no longer facing it as the last choice anyone would make. She was facing it as the only choice Gideon Ashcombe had ever truly wanted to make. Beatrice Kingsley did not take defeat quietly, and defeat, though no formal announcement had yet been made, was exactly what she sensed closing in around her. She had watched Gideon's attention drift further from her own careful performances with each passing day, watched the household staff extend small kindnesses toward Nora that no one dared extend toward the other candidates, and rather than accept the shifting tide, she decided instead to manufacture a storm of her own. It began with a whisper, carefully planted among the household staff, that Nora Whitfield had once been dismissed from a previous position in disgrace, that her quiet manner masked a history of dishonesty no respectable family would tolerate. The rumor spread quickly, as rumors always do in houses full of idle hands and eager gossip, twisting further with each retelling, until, by the time it reached Mrs. Aldridge's ears, it had grown into an accusation of theft from a household Nora had never once set foot in. Nora first learned of the rumor from Peter, who arrived at the garden bench one afternoon, with tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "They are saying you stole something," he said, his small hands clenched into fists. "From another house, before you came here. I told them it was not true, but they would not listen to me." Nora's stomach twisted with a familiar, sickening dread, the kind she remembered from childhood whenever Delphine had accused her of some fabricated wrongdoing, simply to justify a punishment already decided upon. "It is not true, Peter," she said quietly, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of what she suspected was coming. "I know that," Peter said fiercely, "but others do not." By evening, the rumor had reached Gideon, delivered by Mrs. Aldridge, with visible reluctance, and Nora was summoned to his study shortly after supper, her heart pounding with a dread she had not felt since the night of the ballroom. "I do not believe it," Gideon said the moment she entered, before she could even speak in her own defense. "I want you to know that first, before anything else is said. I do not believe a word of it." Relief flooded through her, though it did little to calm the anxious churning beneath her ribs. "Then you already know it is false," she said. "I know," Gideon said, "but I need to understand where such a claim originated, and why, so that I might address it properly, rather than allow it to fester unchecked." Nora explained what little she knew, that the rumor had apparently begun among the staff, though its true source remained unclear, and that Peter had overheard several of the candidates discussing it with poorly concealed satisfaction earlier that same day. Gideon's jaw tightened as he listened, and Nora recognized, for the first time, a flash of genuine anger beneath his usually composed exterior. "Beatrice Kingsley," he said, more statement than question. "I have no proof," Nora said carefully, "only suspicion." "I require very little additional proof at this point," Gideon said grimly. "Her family's estate has fallen into significant debt this past year, a fact she has taken great pains to conceal. A marriage to this house would resolve that difficulty rather conveniently for her. I have suspected for some time that her interest in this trial extends little beyond financial necessity." Nora said nothing, uncertain how to respond to the confirmation of suspicions she had quietly harbored but never voiced aloud. It was one thing to endure Beatrice's cruelty as simple jealousy, another entirely to understand it as calculated desperation. Gideon rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, his expression softening from anger into something gentler, more protective. "I will address this properly tomorrow," he said. "You need not carry the weight of it alone any longer." "What will you do?" Nora asked. "Whatever is necessary, to ensure the truth is understood clearly by everyone in this household," Gideon said, "including Miss Kingsley herself." True to his word, Gideon called the 4 remaining candidates together the following morning, along with the senior household staff, and addressed the rumor directly and without hesitation, stating plainly that any further attempts to spread falsehoods about any candidate, naming Nora specifically, though extending the warning to protect all present, would result in immediate removal from the trial and formal notification to the offending family regarding the conduct displayed under his roof. Beatrice's composure cracked visibly during the address, her carefully maintained mask slipping just enough to reveal the panic beneath, though she said nothing in her own defense, understanding, perhaps, that any denial would only draw further suspicion toward herself. Afterward, as the group dispersed, Odette Farrow approached Nora quietly, her expression uncharacteristically subdued. "I did not spread the rumor," she said, "but I did not stop it either, when I might have. I am sorry for that." Nora studied her for a long moment, surprised by the unexpected apology. "Thank you for saying so," she said simply, and let the matter rest there, unwilling to carry more resentment than necessary through the remaining weeks of the trial. The confrontation, though difficult, marked a turning point within the household. Beatrice retreated into a colder, more distant silence over the following days, her schemes apparently abandoned, at least for the moment, in favor of simply enduring the remainder of the trial with what dignity she had left. Nora, meanwhile, found herself moving through Bramwell Hall, with a new kind of confidence, no longer bracing constantly for the next cruelty, no longer assuming she must earn her place through quiet endurance alone. It was during this period of relative calm that letters began arriving from home, first from Camille, whose tone had shifted from mockery to a strange, grudging curiosity about the rumors reaching even the distant Whitfield estate regarding Nora's apparent favor with the Duke. Then from Iris, whose letter carried a barely concealed note of panic beneath its polite phrasing. And finally, from Delphine herself, whose letter arrived sealed with unusual formality and addressed Nora with a warmth she had never once extended in person. "My dearest Nora," the letter began, and Nora nearly laughed aloud at the unfamiliar endearment. "We have heard wonderful things about your progress at Bramwell Hall, and I wish to express how proud your father would have been to see you flourishing so beautifully. Do write soon, and tell us everything. We think of you constantly, and eagerly await news of your continued success." Nora read the letter twice, searching for the cruelty she was certain must lurk somewhere beneath the surface, and found instead only calculated flattery, the kind Delphine had never once bothered to offer, when Nora's success held no benefit for the rest of the household. She understood immediately what the letter truly represented, not genuine affection, but the first careful move in whatever plan Delphine was already constructing to reclaim advantage from a situation that had, against every expectation, tilted entirely in Nora's favor. She did not respond to the letter that evening, choosing instead to fold it carefully into the same small chest where she kept her mother's faded ribbon, a quiet reminder of exactly what awaited her should Delphine ever find reason to involve herself more directly in the unfolding trial. That reminder, though she did not yet know it, would prove prophetic sooner than she expected. 2 weeks into the trial, with only 10 days remaining before Gideon would make his final decision, an unannounced carriage arrived at the gates of Bramwell Hall, bearing the Whitfield family crest. Nora was in the garden with Peter when word reached her, delivered by a breathless young maid who seemed uncertain whether the news qualified as good or troubling. "Your stepmother has arrived, miss," the maid said. She did not send word ahead. She simply appeared at the gates and insisted on being received. Nora's chest tightened immediately, old instincts rising to the surface with a speed that surprised her, given how much distance she had begun to feel from that house over the past 2 weeks. "Did His Grace receive her?" she asked. "He is with her now, miss, in the front hall." Nora hurried inside, Peter trailing anxiously behind her, and arrived in the entrance hall to find Delphine standing in the center of the marble floor, dressed in her finest traveling clothes, her expression arranged into a mask of warm concern that Nora recognized immediately as entirely false. Gideon stood a short distance away, his posture polite but guarded, clearly having already sensed something amiss in the unannounced visit. "Nora, darling," Delphine said, extending her arms as though expecting an embrace that had never once existed between them in 18 years. "I simply could not stay away any longer. A mother's heart, you understand, worries terribly when her child is so far from home." Nora did not move to embrace her, though she offered a stiff, polite greeting, aware of Gideon's careful attention tracking the exchange. "You did not need to trouble yourself with such a long journey," she said evenly. "Nonsense," Delphine said, her smile never wavering. "Besides, I thought His Grace might appreciate hearing more about your upbringing, directly from family, rather than relying only on whatever impressions the trial itself has provided. There is so much context that a month alone cannot properly convey." Gideon's expression remained carefully neutral, though Nora caught the faint tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what Delphine intended, even if he had not yet decided how to respond to it. "I am certain Miss Whitfield's own conduct has spoken clearly enough these past weeks," Gideon said evenly. "But you are welcome to remain as our guest for the evening, if you wish." Delphine's smile widened, satisfaction flickering briefly across her features before smoothing once more into practiced warmth. "How generous, Your Grace. I would be delighted." The evening meal that followed proved, for Nora, one of the most difficult hours she had endured since arriving at Bramwell Hall. Delphine held court at the table with practiced charm, weaving stories of Nora's childhood that twisted every hardship into something noble, and every act of resilience into a testament to Delphine's own generous guidance, painting herself as a devoted stepmother who had raised an orphaned girl with love and sacrifice. She was such a difficult child at first, Delphine said, laughing lightly, as though sharing a fond memory. So withdrawn, so uncertain of herself. It took years of patience to bring her out of her shell. Nora sat rigid through each fabrication, saying nothing, uncertain whether correcting the lies publicly would help her situation, or only deepen the spectacle Delphine seemed determined to create. It was Peter, seated beside her, as had become his habit during meals, who finally spoke, his young voice cutting through the practiced performance, with the blunt honesty only children possessed. "That is not true," he said suddenly, looking directly at Delphine. "Nora told me she was never allowed to eat at the same table as everyone else. She told me she slept in a room smaller than the linen closet." The table fell into stunned silence. Delphine's composure faltered for the first time that evening, a flash of genuine fury crossing her features, before she managed to smooth it back into practiced calm. "Children often exaggerate," she said quickly, forcing a laugh. "Nora, dear, surely you did not tell him such things." Nora looked at Peter, then at Delphine, and felt something inside her finally settle into place. A decision made without conscious effort, born from 18 years of swallowed truth finally reaching its limit. "I did tell him," she said quietly, meeting Delphine's eyes directly, for the first time in longer than she could remember, because it was true. Gasps rippled faintly around the table. Camille and Iris, who had accompanied Delphine on the journey, and remained largely silent throughout the meal, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet Nora's gaze. "Nora," Delphine said, her voice sharpening beneath its thin veneer of warmth, "I think perhaps this is not the appropriate setting for such discussions." "You are the one who brought up my childhood, Delphine," Nora said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her ribs. "I am simply telling the truth about it, since you seem so determined to rewrite it in front of everyone at this table." Gideon, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying a quiet authority that immediately drew every eye toward him. "Perhaps," he said, "Mrs. Whitfield would care to explain why a child in her care was denied a proper place at the family table, or a room suitable for a member of the household, rather than continue with stories that appear, based on what I have witnessed tonight, to bear little resemblance to the truth." Delphine's face drained of color, her carefully constructed performance collapsing entirely beneath the weight of the Duke's direct question. "Your Grace, I assure you, whatever difficulties existed were simply the natural challenges of blending a household after the loss of Nora's father. I did the best I could under trying circumstances." "The best you could," Gideon repeated, his tone carrying an edge Nora had not heard from him before. "Apparently did not extend to allowing a grieving child a proper bed, or a seat at your table, while your own daughters wanted for nothing." Camille and Iris stared at their plates, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, and for the first time in her life, Nora watched Delphine sit utterly speechless, stripped of every practiced excuse and false warmth that had carried her through countless similar situations in the past. The meal concluded shortly afterward, in strained, uncomfortable silence, and Delphine retired early to the guest quarters prepared for her, her earlier confidence entirely deflated. Nora remained in the dining hall a while longer, her hands still trembling slightly from the confrontation, until Gideon approached and gently placed a hand over hers. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "I have wanted to say those words for 18 years, Nora admitted, her voice thick with emotion she had not expected to surface so suddenly. "I did not think I ever would." "You deserved to say them far sooner," Gideon said gently. "I am only sorry it required tonight's spectacle for the truth to finally be spoken aloud." Nora looked up at him, searching his face for judgment or pity, and finding instead only quiet, steady compassion. "You believed me," she said softly, even before Peter spoke. "I believed you from the very first night in the ballroom," Gideon said. "Everything since has only confirmed what I already understood to be true. You were never the last choice, Nora. Not to me, and certainly not because of anything you lacked. You were always exactly the choice I intended to make." That night, alone in her room, Nora allowed herself to weep. Not from sorrow, but from the strange, overwhelming release of finally being seen and believed after so many years of silent endurance. She thought of the small girl who had once slept in a room barely larger than a closet, who had learned to make herself invisible simply to survive within her own family, and she felt, for the first time, genuine compassion for that girl, rather than shame. Delphine departed the following morning, without ceremony, her carriage pulling away from Bramwell Hall, far earlier than originally planned, Camille and Iris following silently behind her, neither offering so much as a backward glance toward the sister they had spent years dismissing. Nora watched from her window as the carriage disappeared down the long road, and felt, rather than sorrow at their departure, a quiet, settling peace. Whatever cruelty her family still carried within them, it no longer held power over the life she was building at Bramwell Hall, a life built not on the fragile approval of those who had never valued her, but on the steady, honest regard of a man who had seen her worth from the very beginning. Peter found her still standing at the window a while later, and slipped his small hand into hers without a word, the simple gesture, carrying more comfort than any speech could have offered. Together they watched the empty road stretch toward the horizon, and Nora understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that the woman standing at that window bore little resemblance to the girl who had once believed herself unworthy of being chosen. News of Delphine's humiliating visit spread quickly through Bramwell Hall, as such things always did, and though Gideon had made no formal announcement regarding his final decision, the household's remaining candidates seemed to sense, collectively, that the trial's outcome had already been quietly settled. Odette Farrow began speaking with genuine warmth toward Nora in the days that followed, her earlier reluctant apology deepening into something resembling real friendship. Even Beatrice, though her pride would not allow open kindness, softened her hostility into something closer to weary resignation. Gideon, however, remained bound by tradition. The trial period, established generations earlier by his own ancestors, required a full month's observation before any formal decision could be announced, regardless of how clearly his own heart had already settled the matter. Nora understood this and did not press him to act sooner, content instead to spend the remaining days building something honest and unhurried between them, free from the pressure of announcement or expectation. It was during the final week of the trial that circumstances forced Gideon's hand sooner than tradition intended. A letter arrived from the capital, carrying news that the King's Council had grown impatient with the dukedom's prolonged uncertainty regarding succession, and requesting that Gideon appear before the court within the fortnight to formally present his chosen bride, given the political stability such an announcement would provide during an unsettled period in the kingdom's affairs. Gideon called the remaining candidates together the following morning, his expression carrying the weight of a decision he had clearly already made peace with, regardless of tradition's usual timeline. "Circumstances require me to conclude this trial earlier than originally planned," he said, addressing the assembled group with quiet authority. "I have spent the past 3 weeks observing not merely performance, but character, and I believe I have found exactly what I was searching for, sooner than tradition anticipated." The room held its breath, the remaining candidates exchanging uncertain glances, though none appeared genuinely surprised by what followed. "Miss Nora Whitfield," Gideon said, turning to face her directly, "I have known you, in truth, far longer than these past weeks alone. I have watched you endure cruelty with grace, extend kindness where none was required, and speak truth, even when silence would have been easier. I do not choose you as a formality, nor as an obligation to tradition. I choose you because you are, and have always been, the only choice I have ever truly wanted to make." Nora felt the weight of every eye in the room settle upon her, and for the first time in her life, she did not shrink beneath such attention. She stood taller instead, meeting Gideon's gaze fully, and allowed herself, finally, to accept what he was offering, without doubt or hesitation clouding the moment. "I accept," she said simply, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. The formal announcement that followed spread quickly beyond the walls of Bramwell Hall, reaching every corner of the region within days. Word of the Duke's unusual choice, and the circumstances surrounding it, traveled with particular speed once whispers of Delphine's disgraceful conduct during her visit began circulating among noble households eager for scandal. The Whitfield family name, once merely unremarkable, became attached instead to quiet ridicule. Families who had once courted Delphine's favor, now finding convenient reasons to distance themselves from any association with her. Nora felt no satisfaction in her family's fall from grace, though she understood the justice woven through it. She had spent 18 years absorbing their cruelty without complaint, and their downfall, when it finally arrived, came not through any action of her own, but through the simple, undeniable weight of truth, finally being spoken aloud, in a room that could no longer ignore it. Beatrice Kingsley departed Bramwell Hall 2 days after the announcement. Her earlier hostility finally dissolved into something resembling grudging acceptance. She approached Nora briefly before her carriage departed, her expression carefully composed, but her words, when they finally came, surprisingly sincere. "I do not know if I would have behaved with such grace had our positions been reversed," Beatrice said. "I wish you well, Miss Whitfield. Truly." Nora accepted the sentiment with quiet grace of her own, understanding that Beatrice's cruelty had grown from desperation rather than genuine malice, a distinction that made forgiveness, however difficult, somewhat easier to extend. Odette remained a few days longer, promising to write once she returned home, a promise Nora suspected, for once, might actually be kept. The garden grew quieter after the other candidates departed, though it never grew lonely, filled instead with the steady presence of Peter, who had taken to calling Nora by a name he had invented himself, something between cousin and friend, a title that made Nora's heart swell every time she heard it. With the trial concluded and the formal engagement announced, preparations began almost immediately for the wedding itself, a ceremony that would need to occur within a matter of weeks, given the political urgency surrounding it. Nora found herself swept into a world of fittings and arrangements, entirely foreign to the quiet, overlooked existence she had known before arriving at Bramwell Hall, and though the sudden attention occasionally overwhelmed her, she found steady comfort in Gideon's constant presence beside her throughout the preparations. It was during one such fitting, standing before a tall mirror while a seamstress adjusted the fine fabric draped across her shoulders, that Nora caught her own reflection, and felt, for a startling moment, as though she were looking at a stranger. The gown was finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, the fabric shimmering softly in the afternoon light, and the woman reflected back at her bore little resemblance to the girl who had once curtsied quickly at the edge of a crowded ballroom, desperate to disappear before anyone noticed her. "You look uncertain," Gideon observed gently, having entered the room quietly to check on the fitting's progress. "I am not entirely certain who I am looking at," Nora admitted, studying her reflection with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Gideon crossed the room and stood beside her, meeting her eyes in the mirror's reflection, rather than turning to face her directly. "I see the same woman I have seen since that first night in the ballroom," he said softly. "The gown has not changed you, Nora. It has simply allowed everyone else to finally see what I already knew was there." Nora leaned slightly into his steady presence beside her, allowing herself, for once, to fully believe his words, rather than dismiss them with the old, familiar doubt that had shaped so much of her life before Bramwell Hall. The reflection before her was not a stranger, she realized slowly. It was simply herself, finally standing in a light, bright enough to be properly seen. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation, though Nora made certain, amid the endless fittings and arrangements, to preserve the quiet routines that had come to mean so much to her since arriving at Bramwell Hall. Mornings in the garden with Peter remained sacred, untouched by the growing spectacle surrounding the approaching ceremony, and evenings in the library with Gideon continued as well, the two of them often speaking long after the fire had burned low, building the kind of steady, honest foundation that Nora had never once believed she would find in her lifetime. It was during one such evening that Nora finally voiced the doubt she had carried quietly since the engagement's announcement, a doubt rooted so deeply in 18 years of conditioning that she could not fully release it, despite everything that had changed around her. "I keep waiting," she admitted, staring into the fire rather than meeting Gideon's eyes, "for someone to realize the mistake, for someone to stand up during the ceremony itself and declare that surely there has been some error, that a woman like me could never truly belong beside a man like you." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, allowing her words the space they needed before responding. "Do you know what I have come to understand about you, Nora, in these past weeks?" he said eventually. "You have spent so long being told you were the last choice that you have built an entire fortress around the idea, brick by brick, year by year. I understand why. I do not fault you for it. But I would ask you to consider something in return." "What is that?" Nora asked, finally turning to meet his gaze. "That perhaps the fortress was built to protect you from a world that never deserved the person living inside it," Gideon said gently. "And that you are safe now, Nora, to begin setting some of those bricks down." Nora felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being understood so completely, so patiently, by someone who had never once asked her to prove her worth before extending his regard. "It is difficult," she admitted, "after so many years, to simply believe I am wanted, rather than merely tolerated." "I do not tolerate you, Nora," Gideon said firmly. "I have chosen you, deliberately and completely, not once, but every single day since that ballroom, and I intend to continue choosing you for the rest of our lives together." "That is not tolerance, that is devotion." The words settled over her like warmth spreading through long cold hands, and slowly, gradually, over the remaining days before the wedding, Nora began to feel the fortress within her chest ease its grip, brick by careful brick, allowing something softer and more hopeful to take root in its place. Peter, too, played his own quiet role in that gradual unburdening. He had taken to following Nora through the manor's corridors during the final preparations, chattering happily about the wedding, about the new family he would soon have, about a future that no longer felt uncertain or fragile the way it once had for a lonely boy left largely to himself. His easy joy, uncomplicated by the doubts that still occasionally crept into Nora's own heart, offered its own kind of healing, a reminder of exactly what she was building toward beyond the ceremony itself. "Will you still come to the garden after you are married?" Peter asked one afternoon, his small hand tucked into hers as they walked together beneath the blossoming trees. "Every single day," Nora promised, and meant it completely. Word arrived a few days before the ceremony that Camille had written once more, though this letter carried none of Delphine's earlier calculated warmth. Instead, it held something closer to genuine, if awkward, humility, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, of the unfair treatment Nora had endured throughout their shared childhood, and a hesitant hope that perhaps, someday, some measure of relationship might be rebuilt between them. Nora read the letter carefully, weighing its sincerity against years of accumulated hurt, and though she did not yet know what, if anything, she wished to offer in return, she found she no longer carried the same bitter weight she once might have toward her stepsister's belated regret. Time, she suspected, would reveal whether Camille's words held any lasting substance. For now, she simply folded the letter away, choosing not to let it disturb the peace she had worked so hard to build. The night before the wedding, Nora sat alone in her room, the small wooden chest open before her, her mother's faded ribbon resting gently across her palm. She thought of the woman she barely remembered, wondering what she might have said, watching her daughter on the eve of becoming a duchess after a lifetime spent believing herself unworthy of such a title. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she found Gideon standing in the doorway, having clearly stolen a private moment away from his own preparations to seek her out one final time, before tradition would keep them apart until the ceremony itself. "I know it is unconventional to visit you tonight," he said, "but I could not let tomorrow arrive without telling you something first." Nora set the ribbon aside and rose to meet him, her heart full in a way she had never before experienced. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Tomorrow, the entire kingdom will watch as I make you my duchess," Gideon said, taking her hands gently in his own. "But I want you to know, Nora, that the choice was never truly made tomorrow, or even that first night in the ballroom. It was made 3 years ago, beside a market stall, when a young woman knelt beside a stranger and offered kindness without expecting anything in return. I have been choosing you every day since, and I will continue choosing you every day for the rest of my life." Nora felt tears slip freely down her cheeks, though her smile never wavered. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "we have both been waiting a very long time to finally arrive here." "Some things," Gideon said, brushing a gentle thumb across her cheek to catch a falling tear, "are worth every moment of waiting." He remained only a short while longer, mindful of tradition's demands, before finally taking his leave, with a promise that tomorrow would bring the beginning of everything they had both quietly hoped for, without daring to fully believe it possible. Nora returned to her window long after he had gone, watching the stars scatter across the dark sky above Bramwell Hall, and allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to feel the quiet, steady joy of a woman finally arriving exactly where she belonged. Morning arrived at Bramwell Hall dressed in soft golden light, the kind that seemed, to Nora, almost deliberately chosen to match the significance of the day ahead. She woke early, before the household had fully stirred, and lay quietly for a long moment, simply absorbing the strange, wondrous reality that today, at last, she would become Gideon Ashcombe's wife. Mrs. Aldridge arrived shortly after, along with two maids carrying the finished wedding gown between them, its fabric catching the morning light in soft, shimmering waves. Nora stood patiently as they dressed her, each careful adjustment of fabric and lace, feeling less like preparation for a performance, and more like the gentle unveiling of something that had been waiting, quietly, to be revealed all along. "You look radiant, miss," one of the maids said softly, stepping back to admire the finished result. Nora turned toward the mirror, and this time, unlike the uncertain reflection she had studied weeks earlier, during her first fitting, she recognized immediately and completely the woman looking back at her. There was no stranger in the glass, no fortress of doubt clouding her vision. There was only herself, dressed in quiet elegance, standing tall and unafraid, ready to step into a future she had never once believed herself worthy of claiming. Peter arrived just before she was due to descend, dressed in a small formal jacket that made him look far older than his years. His expression, a mixture of solemn importance and barely contained excitement. "You look like a real duchess," he said, staring up at her with wide, admiring eyes. "I feel like one," Nora admitted, smiling as she knelt slightly to meet his gaze more directly. "Thank you, Peter, for everything. For the garden, for your friendship, for believing in me even before I believed in myself." Peter flushed slightly at the praise, then reached up to take her hand as they made their way toward the grand staircase together, his small presence beside her offering a steady comfort as the weight of the day's significance settled fully across her shoulders. The chapel at Bramwell Hall had been transformed for the occasion, its ancient stone walls softened by garlands of white flowers and flickering candlelight, and as Nora paused at the entrance, gathering her courage before the final walk toward the altar, she caught sight of Gideon, waiting at the far end of the aisle, dressed in formal attire that could not disguise the open, unguarded warmth in his expression as his eyes found hers. The walk down the aisle felt, to Nora, both impossibly long and far too brief, every step carrying her further from the girl who had once curtsied quickly at the edge of a crowded ballroom and closer to the woman she had slowly become over these past transformative weeks. She passed rows of gathered nobility, familiar faces from her month at Bramwell Hall, mixed among strangers from the wider kingdom, though she found she cared little for their scrutiny, her attention entirely fixed upon the man waiting patiently ahead. When she finally reached him, Gideon took her hands gently in his own, his eyes bright with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "You came," he said softly, so quietly only she could hear it, an echo of the disbelief she herself had carried for so long, finally reflected back at her. "I did," Nora whispered, smiling through the sudden press of emotion rising in her chest. "Exactly where I belong." The ceremony that followed passed in a warm, golden blur, vows exchanged with quiet sincerity rather than rehearsed formality, promises spoken not for the benefit of the watching crowd, but for the two people making them, each word carrying the full weight of everything they had built together since that strange, impossible night in the ballroom weeks earlier. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted into warm applause, and Gideon, breaking slightly from tradition, lifted Nora's hand to his lips before drawing her fully into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any spoken vow of the devotion now sealed between them. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music and laughter and the warm congratulations of a household that had, over the preceding weeks, come to genuinely embrace their new duchess. Odette Farrow, true to her promise, had returned for the occasion, offering warm congratulations alongside a promise of continued friendship. Even Beatrice Kingsley sent a brief note of well wishes, delivered by messenger, its brevity carrying more sincerity than any lengthier message might have offered. Nora danced that evening in a way she had never once imagined herself capable of, moving easily through the golden light of the ballroom, no longer hiding at the edges behind marble columns and flower arrangements, but standing instead fully visible at the very center of her own joy. Gideon remained close throughout, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes rarely straying from her face, and Peter darted happily between the dancing couples, delighting in an evening that felt, for the first time in his young life, entirely and completely like family. Late in the evening, as the celebration began finally to wind down, Nora found herself standing once more beside the garden fountain where she had first spoken with Peter all those weeks ago. Gideon's hand resting warmly in her own, as they watched the stars scatter across the clear night sky above Bramwell Hall. "Do you remember," Gideon asked quietly, "what you asked me, that first evening in the library, why I chose your name that night, out of everyone gathered in that ballroom?" "I remember," Nora said softly. "I think, perhaps," Gideon continued, "the truer answer is simpler than even the story I told you. I chose you because from the very beginning, long before I understood why, some part of me recognized that you were never truly the last choice at all. You were always the only one." Nora leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as the fountain's gentle water continued its quiet music beside them, and allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to simply feel the steady, complete happiness of a woman who had spent a lifetime believing herself unworthy, finally understanding, beyond any lingering doubt, exactly how deeply and completely she was loved. The girl who had once curtsied quickly at the edge of a crowded ballroom, desperate to disappear before anyone noticed her, had become, at last, a duchess standing proudly in the light, no longer the woman everyone considered the last choice, but the bride her husband had always known, from the very beginning, was the only choice that ever truly mattered.